Welcome to the Family History Guide, Researching Records in Australia. Goal 1, Research and Records. This goal will teach you step by step about the records you need to help you find your Australian ancestors and relatives. The settlement of Australia began in about 1788 with convicts transported from the United Kingdom and Ireland. Between 1788 and 1868, approximately 161,700 convicts, of which approximately 25,000 were women, were transported to Australia. Of these, about 7,000 arrived in 1833 alone. The convicts were transported as punishment for crimes committed in Britain and Ireland, and you can also search for these people in the United Kingdom court records, including arrest, incarceration, trial, and transportation records. The records continue for each convict with passenger records on the ships and records of the convict's arrival in Australia. You can begin your search for convict ancestors with the Australian Convict Records website, which will help you find the place where your ancestor was convicted. The following slides are examples of the records found for a transported person named Edward Rodwell, who was deported from England to Australia. On 1 August 1837 in the Norfolk County Assize, Edward Rodwell, age 21, was convicted of housebreaking and sentenced to 14 years after 1 month's imprisonment. On 21 August 1837, he was imprisoned aboard the ship HMS Justita, which was moored at Greenwich. The Justita was a prison ship where many convicts were briefly held awaiting transport to Australia. He was ordered transported for 14 years. The document also described him as a blacksmith and of very bad character. Later, on 2 October 1827, he was transported to New South Wales on board the ship Waterloo. The ship arrived on 8 February 1838 in New South Wales. From 23 December 1840 to 1846, he resided in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia. Later, on 19 January 1850, he received a conditional pardon. The conditional pardon allowed Edward Rodwell freedom within the colony. He was, however, not permitted to step foot in England or Ireland until his 14 years had been completed. Edward Rodwell as a former convict who was deported from England to Australia, obtained a ticket of leave and married Sarah Parkinson 12 February 1850. They had 2 children, John Edward in 1850 and Sarah Ann Rodwell in 1852. He left Australia with Sarah Parkinson's younger sister Eliza, abandoning his first wife and children. On the 10th of October 1852, Edward and Eliza were back in England at Tottenham, Norfolk, where their first child, Susanna Rodwell, was born. There are now further records in England about this family. The first free settlers arrived in Australia the 16th of February, 1793. The South Australia Act of 1834 provided that transportation of convicts was forbidden, and subsequently poor English immigrants began to be assisted by the 1834 English Poor Law Amendment Act. Some of the major national genealogical record sources include Australia's civil registrations, or vital records. You can see a summary of the availability of civil registration records on the FamilySearch.org Research Wiki, and an outline of the information recorded in the records. Additional Australian national genealogical records consist of the following: convict records, church records, land and property, military records, passenger lists, and British emigration records. Here is an example of tracing a family from England to Australia. The James Parkinson family lived in Ramsey, Huntingdonshire, England, and began their immigration on 11 March 1849. When you have the family's location, you can usually find more records. Always focus on the location and time frame. You can find information about the Australian census records in the FamilySearch.org Research Wiki. The first countrywide census was taken in 1881. National censuses have been regularly taken by the Australian government since 1911. Although census records are usually regarded as valuable resources, this is not the case for Australia. To protect individual privacy, all national censuses were destroyed after statistical information was collected. Earlier in 1882, a fire destroyed the New South Wales census records for 1846, 1851, 1856, 1861, 1871, and 1881, including the household forms from 1861, 1871, and 1881. Therefore, census usage in Australia research is different from census research in other countries. One of the largest and most comprehensive online digital resources for records in the world is maintained by the National Library of Australia. The library's digital archive is called trove.nla.gov.au. Here is a screenshot of Trove's family history resources in state, territory, and overseas collections. Many of these collections are either limited to those with local access to the libraries through library cards and in-person use, or are fee-based. Each archive and repository has its own rules on the availability of access to the records. You will need to take some time learning about each entity's access. The Australian Cemeteries database has an exhaustive list of cemetery locations and burials. Remember the large online genealogy websites. Each of these websites have substantial collections of Australian records. Keep looking. The links in the Family History Guide will provide you with valuable information about how to find your ancestors in Australia. Study the choices in this goal to develop your research skills.